Hey everybody, and welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we will be watching Napoleon's Retreat from Moscow 1812 by Epic History TV. So in the last two reactions of this series, we witnessed Napoleon's disastrous invasion of Russia and the extremely brutal Battle of Borodino. So, now we're coming to the end of the Russian campaign, and I know enough about the Napoleonic Wars to know that it does not end well. And it did not start well, so no part of the campaign has really gone well. It's been very brutal and pretty disastrous for Napoleon. So yeah, we're about to see how this whole thing ends. I would ask you guys to please check out the Patreon. There's exclusive content on there. And let's jump right into this reaction. Oh, if only.
Russia, 1812.
Yes.
Napoleon invades his former ally with the largest army Europe has ever seen.
Here we go with the intro
For
again.
the French Emperor, the decisive blow remains frustratingly beyond reach.
The brutal Battle of Borodino,
Russia's
as we saw last time,
is unlike anything he's ever encountered. And as winter closes in, his army begins the most infamous retreat in history.
Oh yes. I think even people who are not at all familiar with this conflict will be familiar with Napoleon's famous retreat from Russia.
The 15th of September, 1812. 83 days after invading Russia, a week after his costly victory at Borodino, Napoleon entered Moscow. He expected to be greeted by dignitaries, formally offering the city's surrender. Instead, he discovered that 90% of Moscow's inhabitants had fled.
Yep.
A fire had started the previous night and was blamed on drunken soldiers.
Napoleon has finally made it to Moscow, and up until this point, the Russian strategy has been to basically flee and burn, the supplies and Russian villages so that Napoleon cannot resupply his men. Of course, Moscow is such an important city to Russia that Napoleon thought, well, this is going to be different. Once I make it to Moscow, they can't run anymore. They're going to have to come to me, surrender. They don't want me to just conquer their city with no resistance. But after the costly Battle of Borodino, that is basically exactly what happens. Napoleon reaches Moscow, expecting, dignitaries and an end to this costly campaign, and he doesn't get any of it. And well, we're about to see what else happens.
But over the next 48 hours, fires continued to break out across Moscow, until most of the city was ablaze. Count Fyodor Rostopchin, the city's governor, had ordered that Moscow be destroyed rather than allowed to fall into enemy hands.
Not only is Napoleon not met with the end to the conflict he was expecting, but the city itself is not entirely, but burned down. Much of it is burned down. This is a, pretty major move to take. Not only are the Russians not going to defend their city from Napoleon, but they will allow it to burn to the ground. That is some, real perseverance right there. And probably an unpopular decision with many people, but it was the one that they took.
And now fires were being started deliberately by Russian criminals, freed from jail and acting on police orders. French soldiers rounded up and shot any they could catch. But the inferno was impossible to contain. In 4 days, 2/3 of Moscow was destroyed.
Wow.
With the fires finally under control, Napoleon's soldiers turned their attention to systematically looting the ruined city. While from his new quarters in the Kremlin, Napoleon sent a letter to Emperor Alexander in St. Petersburg, inviting him to make peace and end the war. He received no reply.
Yeah, that's a very Alexander decision to make. He's not going to do anything he doesn't want to do, and he's not even going to dignify Napoleon's request with a response.
Napoleon waited, confident that Alexander would eventually negotiate. But as the days passed, he grew increasingly uneasy. Cossack raids were disrupting his vital communications with Paris, as well as the arrival of supplies. While the steady attrition of French forces and Russian reinforcements meant Napoleon was outnumbered for the first time in the campaign.
Yeah, and the supply and communication lines have been a massive issue this whole time, but now Napoleon is seriously far into the interior of Russia. And he's at a point where, he thinks this campaign should be ending, but it's not. So the supply lines and communication lines have to be kept up, but they are seriously strained and under, hit-and-run attacks from the Russians and the Cossacks. So, he's still in a really bad situation, and the situation is getting worse by the day.
Rumors also reached him that his reluctant allies, Prussia and Austria, were in secret talks with his enemies. Napoleon had proposed that the army winter in Moscow, but that now looked too dangerous. Reluctantly, he accepted that the army would have to move back to Smolensk to find safe winter quarters. Napoleon knew how severe Russian winters could be, but continued to put off his departure, reassured by fine October weather, and hoping that at the last minute there might be a message from Alexander offering peace. It never came. On the 13th of October, the first light snow fell.
Uh-oh.
5 days later, Kutuzov launched a surprise attack on Murat's advance guard at Vinkovo and defeated it. Napoleon, stung into action, gave the order for the army to leave Moscow the next day.
Wow.
Our video sponsor, the legendary World of Tanks.
Alright, well, check out, this video from Epic History TV. It's linked down below. And check out their sponsor. We want to show some respect to the original creators and, make sure they're compensated for their fantastic work.
Is this all of and the code TANKTASTIC,
Alright.
a sign-up bonus of a premium light tank, 500 gold, fray and figure out your own tactical style.
Check all that stuff out.
Fearless.
Yeah, it has cost a lot to get here. A lot of Russian lives, property, crops. But now Napoleon is on the back foot. This is not a position he wants to be in. It's not a position he expected to be in. He did not expect the initial campaign to even be this far into the interior. So, Napoleon is definitely not prepared for this situation. And now, as Alexander says, now is the moment my campaign begins. It's cost a lot, but, he's seeing the benefits.
$100,000 men of the Grande Armée left Moscow in a column 10 miles long, with an estimated 40,000 carriages and carts. There were women and children too, army wives and the vivandières, the women who cooked for the soldiers, as well as some civilians. Every wagon and pack was stuffed with as much food and loot as possible. As he set off, Sergeant Bourgogne of the Imperial Guard made an inventory of his pack. It contained several pounds of sugar, some rice, some biscuit, half a bottle of liqueur, a woman's Chinese silk dress embroidered in gold and silver, several gold and silver ornaments, amongst them a piece of the cross of Ivan the Great. Besides these, I had my uniform, a woman's large riding cloak, 2 silver pictures in relief, 12 inches long and 8 high, all in the finest workmanship. Also several lockets, and a Russian prince's spittoon set with precious stones.
A lot of expensive loot. That loot won't do you much good if you're, dead and frozen at the side of the road, of course.
I wore over my shirt a yellow silk waistcoat, which I had made myself out of a woman's skirt. Over that, a large cape lined with ermine and a large pouch, hung at my side by a silver cord. This was full of various things, amongst them a crucifix in gold and silver and a little Chinese porcelain vase. Then there were my firearms, powder flask, and 60 cartridges in the box. This heavily encumbered army did not yet realize it was in a race against time. The Russians were beginning to move against the flanks of Napoleon's 550-mile-deep salient. That very day, Wittgenstein's army was driving back Marshal Saint-Cyr's outnumbered force at Polotsk and drawing Victor's 9th Corps west to support them. In the south, Admiral Chichagov's advance had Schwarzenberg's Austrian Corps falling back to cover Warsaw.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, Napoleon is not in a good position, and he's not in a position he expected to be in. His supply lines, his communication lines, and his men are so exposed, far into the interior of Russia, and now the Russians can start pushing in from both sides. This is really not a good situation that the French are in.
The corridor was closing. And then there was the weather. Though Napoleon was confident his army could reach winter quarters in Smolensk in 20 days, well before the more extreme temperatures were due to hit. Napoleon planned to withdraw via Kaluga, through unspoilt country where the army could forage for supplies. But Kutuzov sent General Dokhturov's 6th Corps to block the road at Maloyaroslavets. In fierce fighting, Italian troops of Eugene's 4th Corps drove the Russians out of the town. It was a hard-won victory, reminiscent of the fighting at Borodino. Kutuzov now stood between Napoleon and Kaluga. Napoleon now took the unusual step of conferring with his marshals. And after discussing various options, he decided that rather than seek another major battle, they would retreat the way they'd come, along the Smolensk road.
This is definitely sort of different behavior than we have seen from Napoleon in the past, but he's in a different position than he's usually in. Napoleon, this is the worst position he's ever been in. We haven't seen him in a position really like this before. So, he is behaving differently, but you sort of have to behave differently to live up to the situation that you're in. Now that Napoleon's retreating, sort of the Russians have the advantage because, the longer they can hold him back, the worse it gets for him, both in terms of weather and supplies, as has been mentioned before. So this is just like a really terrible situation for the Grande Armée.
Napoleon had hoped to avoid this route, as it meant marching back through country already stripped bare of supplies. The day after the fighting at Maloyaroslavets, Napoleon was nearly captured by a group of Cossacks.
Wow.
And saved only by General Rapp's charge at the head of his escort. After this close shave, Napoleon had a phial of poison made up, which he carried around his neck in case of capture.
Jeez.
Napoleon's army set off on its new course, shadowed at a respectful distance by Kutuzov's army to the south. They passed the old battlefield of Borodino, a grisly, unnerving sight. where crows pecked at half-buried corpses.
Oh, man.
Relentless marching quickly began to tire out men and horses. A few days later, the temperature fell below freezing. The army's overworked, starving horses died en masse.
So now we're getting to the point when the winter really starts to play a role. And someone made a great comment about this on the other video. You know, there is somewhat of a popular perception that Napoleon was defeated by the harsh Russian winter. But as you can see, everything's already terrible. It's not just the winter. The winter is going to play a big role, as we'll see. But, you know, Napoleon is already struggling with his supply lines. His men are already exhausted, collapsing. They can't carry all the loot that they've brought with them. He's been harassed by Cossack raiders along the whole way. Now the Russian military is holding up his advance. So sure, the Russian winter plays a role in Napoleon's disastrous retreat, but everything has already gone really bad. All the other factors are already in place. So, it's kind of counters this popular myth that it was, mainly the winter that stopped him. No, it was all of these factors that, led to this really bad situation that Napoleon has put himself in.
Discipline began to break down as some drivers simply dumped the sick and wounded by the roadside to try to ensure their own survival. As the French column became increasingly strung out, General Miloradovich, commanding Kutuzov's advance guard, fell on Davout's rear guard outside Vyazma. For a few hours, Davout's first corps was cut off until Eugène and Ney came to his rescue. The battle ended with street fighting in Vyazma as the French hastily evacuated the burning town.
Man.
For the soldiers of the Grande Armée, so unaccustomed to retreats and routes, Vyazma was an alarming, demoralizing blow.
Yeah, and just, try and put yourself in the mindset of one of the men there at the time, one of the men in the Grande Armée. Up until this point, you have been so dominant, you've dominated Europe. Now, there have been some challenges in Spain and Portugal, that's for sure, but, the Grande Armée has been so powerful, they've held such an advantage over every other force that they've fought. And now, you have been on a several long-month campaign into Russia. You're exhausted. You're probably low on supplies already. You've seen some of the most brutal fighting you've ever witnessed. Just absolutely horrifying stuff. Every town you come across has, been destroyed or is in the process of being destroyed and burnt down. You made it all the way to Moscow, where you thought that it was all going to come to an end. Instead, the city was burned down, and now you're retreating. As you retreat, you encounter more absolutely brutal fighting, and now people are just dropping dead during the march. They're freezing to death, they're starving, the sick and wounded are being dumped in the side of the road. I mean, it's just horrific. It's an absolutely horrific scene. One that, of course, we can't even imagine, get even close to imagining. But you can, empathize with the absolutely apocalyptic situation that these men were in, Of course, morale must have been absolutely rock bottom at this point. Well, I mean, it's only going to get worse, so maybe it's not rock bottom yet. But yeah, this is just a horrible, horrible situation to be in if you're part of the Grande Armée, and an unprecedented situation, because you've had so much success up until this point.
On the 4th of November, it began to snow heavily.
Uh-oh.
The next night, temperatures plummeted to minus 20 degrees centigrade.
Jesus.
Few men or women had proper winter clothing or access to shelter. Many froze to death overnight.
Oh, man.
The next morning, wagons and guns were abandoned. Many soldiers sought to save themselves, ignoring officers, stealing horses and food, and leaving the column to scour the countryside for supplies. Many of these foragers were found by the Cossacks. Some cut down or lanced, others robbed of every possession and left to freeze. In a few cases, they were handed over to peasants, eager for retribution against the foreign invaders who had plundered all they owned.
As a soldier, you're in such a bad situation that you can't even escape by deserting. You desert, and you get killed, or tortured, or captured, or all three. It's just absolutely horrible.
As the army struggled on towards Smolensk through blizzards, Napoleon ordered Eugene's 4th Corps to strike out for Vitebsk, where there were large French supply depots. But Vitebsk had already fallen to the Russians. 4th Corps was too weak to fight its way through, and rejoined the army, minus its artillery and most of its baggage.
Jeez.
A colonel who saw 4th Corps at this stage described men without shoes, almost without clothes, exhausted and famished, sitting on their packs, sleeping on their knees, and only rousing themselves out of this stupor to grill slices of horse meat or melt bits of ice. Just 3 weeks after leaving Moscow, a third of the army was dead or captured. About half the rest formed a growing army of stragglers, men without units, prepared to fight only to survive.
It's hardly even an army at this point. It's just a massive group of desperate, starving, freezing, exhausted people who are trying to desperately make their way west. The fighting ability of this force, think of how greatly depleted it's got to be. It's looking very different from the professional fighting force that the Grande Armée once was. It's, a real fall from grace. Not at any fault of the soldiers. This is not on them. It's on, frankly, Napoleon, who's, got them into this situation. It is his fault. He was unprepared. He was unprepared for this situation. Now this is the situation they're in. So it's really tragic, actually. It's really, really horrific situation to be in.
Napoleon reached Smolensk on the 9th of November. The first troops into town ransacked the supply depots, leaving nothing for those who followed, including Ney's rearguard, which arrived 6 days later.
Yikes.
Napoleon had hoped to make Smolensk his winter base, but the state of the army and lack of supplies meant the retreat had to continue. But the 5 days he spent there gave Kutuzov time to circle ahead and prepare an ambush.
Oh no.
When the French retreat resumed, he struck 30 miles west of Smolensk at Krasny. In 3 days of desperate fighting through knee-deep snow, Napoleon used his Imperial Guard to hold open the road, as Eugene and Davout's corps fought their way through the ambush with heavy losses.
Jesus.
2 regiments of the Young Guard were ordered to make a sacrificial counterattack to keep the Russians at bay, and were virtually annihilated. Kutuzov held back many of his troops and was blamed for not trying to destroy Napoleon's army when he had the chance. It's possible he was concerned at the number of raw conscripts in his own army, also suffering terribly in the freezing conditions.
Yeah, even though Kutuzov didn't completely destroy Napoleon's forces, it seems to only get worse for the Grande Armée. It is pretty remarkable they even made it past this. Perhaps it is because Kutuzov didn't fully commit, though maybe he was right to. Maybe, I'm sure his forces weren't in great shape either. But yeah, just more and more brutal brutal fighting among men who are in no condition to fight. It just gets worse for the French forces, basically. I mean, I would say there's definitely a perseverance present amongst the French forces, although at this point it may be more accurate to call it a desperation. They are desperately fighting to make their way west. They have really no choice. They have to keep going. So, I mean, this is desperate men at their lowest point, fighting for just pure survival.
Not every French corps broke through at Krasny. Marshal Ney and his 6,000-strong rearguard arrived on the 18th of November to find the road blocked by 60,000 Russian troops, and no sign of the promised support from Davout's First Corps. Ney's men hurled themselves against the Russian lines with desperate courage, but were mown down. Rejecting several invitations to surrender, Ney led the survivors in a daring night crossing of the Dnieper River, then across 45 miles of open country under constant attack from Platov's Cossacks to reach Orsha. By the time Ney rejoined the army, his rearguard was down to just 800 fighting men, leading a column of several thousand stragglers. The army regarded his escape as a miracle, and when Napoleon heard of it, he immediately dubbed Marshal Ney the bravest of the brave.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I do respect the courage and perseverance, though at a certain point I've got to wonder, when do you surrender? When are the potential losses just too great to handle? Because this is just more brutal fighting with extremely high casualty levels. Yes. Beginning to be very serious. It wasn't serious before, huh?
Napoleon had escaped one trap, but now 3 Russian armies were closing in from different directions and outnumbered him nearly 3-1. From the east, Kutuzov's main army with 65,000 men. From the north, Wittgenstein with 30,000, steadily driving back Marshal Victor's 9th Corps. And from the south, Admiral Chichagov's army of Moldavia with 34,000, having detached General Ostensaken with 30,000 to prevent Schwarzenberg's Austrians and Reynier's Saxon Corps marching to Napoleon's aid. Napoleon was heading for Minsk, a major French supply base with vast stores of the food, clothing, shoes and ammunition that his army so desperately needed. But on the 21st of November, disastrous news arrived. Minsk had fallen to Chichagov.
Oh no.
He then marched on Borisov, driven out the Polish garrison, and captured its bridge over the Berezina River.
God, honestly, I mean, this is disastrous. I don't know. Obviously, I know about the retreat from Russia and the Napoleonic Wars in general. I didn't know about it too specifically. Learning about all of these details, I'm amazed that any of the Grand Armée made it out of there alive. I mean, this seems, if I didn't know better, I would expect it to end right here. I would expect, Napoleon and the Grand Armée to be completely defeated and captured or killed. That's what I would think was coming. Now, I know that doesn't happen, so, I'm curious to see how any French forces get out of this, because, like I keep saying, it seems to just keep getting worse and worse for them.
By rights, the Berezina ought to have frozen solid by now, so Napoleon could have crossed anywhere. But a sudden thaw had turned the river into a torrent of ice and freezing water. Napoleon was at least joined by the hard-fighting Marshal Oudinot and his 2nd Corps, which hadn't suffered as badly as the main column on its retreat from Polotsk.
Okay.
Oudinot launched an immediate counterattack on Borisov and retook the town, but couldn't stop the Russians burning the bridge. With no other bridge for miles in either direction, it seemed Napoleon's exhausted army was finally doomed.
Yeah.
But there was one sliver of hope. Polish cavalry had found a ford across the river near the village of Studienka. Napoleon issued a flurry of orders. Second Corps was to fake preparations for a river crossing south of Borisov. Victor's 9th Corps, arriving from the north, was to form a rear guard east of Studienka to hold the Russians at bay, while engineers worked as quickly as possible to build pontoon bridges across the river and win Napoleon's army a fighting chance of escape.
Well, it's good to know that Napoleon still has, his abilities. He's made a lot of mistakes in this campaign. He's been completely unprepared. But, in this, we do get a glimpse of his brilliance, which, and you can't question his brilliance. We've seen his strategic brilliance throughout this series, Clearly, he was a great general. He's also made a lot of mistakes, but in here, you got to look at the, decisive, ambitious Napoleon that we've known up to this point.
On the afternoon of the 25th of November, General Eblé's Dutch engineers began building two 300-foot pontoon bridges across the Berezina River. They worked day and night, sometimes chest deep in freezing water, and completed both bridges in less than 24 hours. Few of the engineers survived the ordeal.
Jesus.
Chichagov had been totally fooled by the diversion south of Borisov.
Nice.
Was moving his troops south to face it, allowing Napoleon's army to begin crossing its rickety bridges virtually unopposed. Oudinot's 2nd Corps led the way to secure a bridgehead, followed the next day by the remnants of the main army. Priority was given to formed troops, still able to fight. For the time being, the army's vast crowd of stragglers remained on the far bank. By the time Chichagov realized his mistake and began moving north,
I mean, this is so incredibly desperate, it's stressing me out. Like, this is such a desperate escape. Like I said, it's remarkable they made it out at all. But, I mean, it's just like the worst possible situation imaginable that they appear to be about to escape from. Just barely. Just barely.
Napoleon had troops in place to defend the crossing. On the east bank, General Partonneux's 12th Division, 4,000 relatively fresh troops from Victor's 9th Corps, formed the rearguard. As Platov's Cossacks approached from the east, the vanguard of Kutuzov's main army, Partonneux tried to rejoin 9th Corps. But caught in a swirling blizzard, with visibility down to 50 meters, he marched straight into Wittgenstein's army.
Oh no.
His entire division was killed or captured.
Oh, Jesus.
The next morning, Chichagov and Wittgenstein launched coordinated attacks on both sides of the river. There was desperate fighting on the west bank, where Marshal Oudinot was, yet again, seriously wounded, but his Swiss infantry held the line, until General Doumerc's cuirassiers, the army's last heavy cavalry, charged and routed the Russians. At great cost, Polish and German troops of Victor's rearguard held off the Russians until dark, then pulled back across the bridges.
Man.
For 2 nights, officers had been trying to get the vast camp of stragglers to cross the bridges when they weren't being used. But with temperatures reaching -30 centigrade, they'd preferred to stay put, huddled around their fires.
That is, I mean, that is unbelievably freezing. That is, obviously we all know how cold the Russian winter is, but that is so crazy cold.
At dawn on the 29th,
Oh
with
no.
the army leaving and the Russians approaching, thousands of stragglers surged in panic towards the bridges. Dozens were crushed underfoot. Others fell or were pushed into the water, or tried to swim, which was certain death. When French engineers burned the bridges at 9 a.m., thousands were cut off and left to the mercy of the advancing Cossacks.
I mean, this retreat, you know, it's not just a disaster for Napoleon and the Grande Armée. This is like a human disaster. You know, all of these stragglers, non-combatants, those who can no longer fight, stranded and unable to escape. I mean, this is just a disaster in just human terms. I mean, this is it's pretty horrific.
Some became prisoners. Others were simply put out of their misery.
Yeah.
Since the retreat began 43 days earlier, the Grande Armée had marched nearly 500 miles, under constant attack, starved, exhausted, and for the last 23 days, in lethal sub-zero temperatures, without proper clothing or shelter. In that time, the fighting strength of the Grande Armée had been reduced from around 124,000 men to 20,000.
My
With
God.
as many stragglers still following the army. As the retreat continued to Vilna, the weather turned even worse, the temperatures falling to -37 degrees centigrade.
The French can just not get a break.
The Russian armies at least now held back, leaving the winter, Cossacks and Russian peasants to finish off the invaders. On the 5th of December, Napoleon left the army, traveling incognito across Europe at breakneck speed,
Wow.
and reaching Paris in just 13 days. Naturally, English satirists capitalized on Napoleon seeming to abandon his defeated army. And many soldiers did regard it as an act of betrayal. But his generals supported his decision to leave. There'd already been one attempted coup against Napoleon in Paris, and there was much work to be done to rebuild the army and reassure France's allies. On the 9th of December, 51 days after the retreat began, around 20,000 ragged survivors of the Grande Armée began crossing the Niemen River.
I mean, I was saying it's remarkable that the Grande Armée made it out at all. But I mean, this is an absolute shell of the Grande Armée that entered Russia. You know, we've got 20,000 weakened men who barely made it out at all. I mean, the fact that they made it out is remarkable, but just how much has been lost is, you know, it's crazy. And Napoleon leaving is tough, you know. It definitely does, you know, would feel like a betrayal. And it's not a good look, leaving your men like that. But at the same time, you know, I can understand that Napoleon does need to secure his base of power. He needs to make sure that he's not, you know, overthrown. So that's sort of a tough situation to be in. But I understand the reasons he had to leave. It just, you know, would look very bad to a lot of people.
Back into friendly Polish territory. According to legend, Marshal Ney was the last man across.
Jeez.
Napoleon's invasion of Russia had proved to be one of the greatest military disasters in history.
Yeah.
He had made fatal miscalculations about geography, logistics, and above all, Russia's political and strategic response to his invasion.
Yeah.
These blunders cost his empire around 500,000 men,
Oh my
as well as
god.
250,000 horses and 1,000 cannon.
Look at those numbers. You know, what's crazy is that, you know, oftentimes when we look at casualties, captured or missing, those combined will be a lot more than dead. In this case, we've got 100,000 captured, which is already an insane number, and 375,000 dead. I mean, the dead outnumber the captured by 3 times, almost 4 times. These are insane numbers of men to lose. You know, this has got to be crippling to the French forces, and you can see why this is, you know, such an infamous campaign. Though, as I mentioned earlier, you know, we can now see that the retreat itself plus the winter only accounted for a part of that. You know, other factors that we've discussed in length, such as, you know, Napoleon's miscalculations about supplies, the Russian response, the Cossacks, all that kind of stuff, plus the rest of the campaign, you know, the invasion itself accounted for a ton of the destruction done. But yeah, I mean, overall, just a really tragic loss of life.
Put another way, of every 12 men who marched into Russia with the Grande Armée, 1 was killed in action or died of wounds. 2 were taken prisoner, 1 of whom died in captivity.
Jeez.
7 died from disease or the effects of climate. Just 2 returned alive.
Oh my god. And imagine how you'd feel if you were one of those too. I mean, I'm sure relieved, but also probably guilty, horrified, just traumatized. You know, you would probably be a shell of your former self after everything you'd been through. Just what a horrible position to be in.
Contrary to myth, many more soldiers had died in the summer advance from heat, typhus, and dysentery than were lost in the winter retreat.
Right. This is the point I was making about the misconceptions about how bad the winter was.
Russian military casualties were estimated at 150,000, and a
Wow.
huge but unknown number of civilian deaths. The Russian campaign was a catastrophe for Napoleon. Not just in lost troops and resources, but in damage to prestige and reputation.
Yeah.
That winter, all his enemies sensed weakness and prepared to join forces against him. But the Emperor wasn't going down without a fight. Back in Paris, he admitted to his ministers, "Fortune has dazzled me, gentlemen. I've let it lead me astray. Instead of following my plan, I went to Moscow. I thought I'd make peace there. I stayed too long. I've made a grave mistake, but I'll have the means to repair it."
Okay, well, at the very least, Napoleon does recognize some of the mistakes he's made. He's self-aware enough to see what's some of the stuff that's gone wrong. Okay. That was an amazing video, as always, from Epic History TV. A pretty tragic one, to be honest, but a really good one. So now, you know, Napoleon and the Grande Armée and France have been greatly weakened with this disastrous campaign in Russia. Not only were they weakened in terms of manpower, but as was mentioned, reputation-wise. You know, this was a great blow to the reputation of Napoleon and his men. You know, they were seen as almost unstoppable before this. But this proved to the rest of Europe that, you know, they were only human. If they could round up enough men and, you know, fight well enough, they could beat Napoleon. Not to mention, you know, we've also seen the situation in Spain and Portugal, that was also not going well for the French. You know, the French forces were struggling to keep control of the land. They were under constant attack from guerrilla fighters and Portuguese, British, and Spanish forces. So at this point, sort of everything's closing in on Napoleon. We're going to see how the Napoleonic Wars end, Napoleon fighting back, and, you know, the rest of the conflict. We've got a couple more videos in this series. So yeah, if you guys enjoyed this one, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, check out the Patreon. I'd really appreciate that. I hope to see you guys with the next video, the next one in this series. And I hope you guys are all having a good day. I will see you again next time. Goodbye.